The sky over Anzio was the color of rust and ash when Lieutenant Samuel Cross felt the first shudder run through his B-24's fuselage. It wasn't the familiar vibration of turbulence or flak proximity. This was something deeper, more final, like the aircraft itself had taken a mortal wound and was trying to tell him goodbye. Through the cockpit glass he could see black smoke streaming from the No. 3 engine. And below, the Italian coastline twisted like a scar across the earth, beautiful and terrible in the winter light of January 1944. "We're losing altitude," his co-pilot shouted over the intercom, but Samuel had already felt it in his bones. That sickening sensation of gravity reclaiming what had briefly escaped its grip. Around them, the rest of the formation was pulling away, their bomber falling behind like a wounded bird dropping from the flock. He thought of his mother in Alabama, how she'd pressed her Bible into his hands the day he left for flight training, her face carved with worry and pride in equal measure. He thought of the white commanding officer who'd called him boy that morning during briefing, even though the silver bars on Samuel's collar said otherwise. He thought of how he'd proven himself over and over in training at Tuskegee, in combat missions over North Africa and now Italy, and how none of it had ever quite been enough. The second burst of anti-aircraft fire hit them portside, and the world became noise and chaos and the smell of burning oil. Samuel heard screaming through the intercom. Thompson, the tail gunner, a kid from Detroit who'd never stopped talking about the Dodgers. Then silence where Thompson's voice had been, and Samuel knew with terrible certainty what that silence meant. "Bail out," he ordered, his voice steady even as his hands trembled on the controls. "Everybody out now." Through the smoke filling the cockpit, he watched his co-pilot. Lieutenant Davis, a white officer from Virginia who'd initially refused to fly with a Negro pilot until their commanding officer made it an order, hesitate for just a moment before reaching for the bailout handle. Their eyes met, and in that fraction of a second, Samuel saw something he'd rarely encountered in Davis's gaze: respect. Or maybe just the equality that imminent death grants to all men regardless of the color of their skin. Then Davis was gone through the hatch and Samuel was fighting to keep the plane level long enough for the rest of his crew to escape, counting seconds in his head, imagining each man tumbling through the sky toward Italian soil held by German forces, when he finally reached for his own chute and threw himself into the screaming wind. The relief lasted only as long as his free fall, that brief moment of weightlessness before the parachute deployed, and jerked him back into the war, into history, into the particular nightmare that awaited a black American soldier in enemy hands. The landing drove the air from his lungs, his body slamming into frozen earth plowed and torn by months of artillery. For a moment he lay still, taking inventory of his limbs, his consciousness, his situation. Above him his parachute collapsed like a dying jellyfish, white silk against brown soil. In the distance he could hear engines, vehicles moving across the landscape. He struggled free of his harness, his flight suit torn at the knee. Blood seeping through where something sharp had caught him during the descent or the landing. He couldn't be sure which. His service pistol was still holstered at his hip, and for one wild moment he considered making a stand, going out in a blaze that would at least be his own choice. But that was pride talking, the part of him that had survived every insult and indignity by turning it into fuel, into determination. He was a soldier. He had protocols to follow: survive, escape, resist, return. The protocols lasted until 3 Wehrmacht soldiers appeared over the ridge, their rifles trained on him with the casual precision of men who'd done this many times before. Samuel raised his hands slowly, deliberately, keeping his movements calm and clear. No sudden motions, nothing that might give a nervous German boy an excuse to fire. As they approached, he could see the surprise ripple across their faces, the visible recalibration happening behind their eyes as they processed what they were seeing. A Negro in an officer's uniform, an American pilot. Their propaganda had prepared them for something else entirely, for the caricatures and cartoons that portrayed black soldiers as barely human, as primitive and cowardly. What they found instead was a man standing with his shoulders squared despite the cold and pain, meeting their eyes with the calm bearing of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he represented. Even here, especially here, the youngest German soldier, barely 20 if that, said something in rapid German that Samuel didn't catch. But the tone was clear enough, confusion mixed with something that might have been curiosity or even wariness. The sergeant, who seemed to be in charge, an older man with iron gray hair beneath his helmet and the weathered face of someone who'd seen much of this war, stepped forward and gestured with his rifle for Samuel to remove his pistol slowly. Samuel complied, using 2 fingers to extract the weapon from its holster and place it on the ground. The sergeant said something in broken English. "You are officer? Flieger?" Samuel nodded. Lieutenant Samuel Cross, United States Army Air Forces, serial number 0796432. The words came out steady. Rehearsed, the only information he was required to give under the Geneva Convention. They marched him across the battlefield, past the wreckage of his B-24 still burning in a field a mile distant, past Italian farmers who watched from the windows of damaged houses with eyes that held neither sympathy nor hostility, just the exhausted neutrality of people who'd endured too many armies crossing their land. Samuel's knee throbbed with each step, and the cold worked its way through his flight suit, but he kept his head up, his pace steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him stumble. The sergeant walked beside him rather than behind, and Samuel caught him glancing over several times, studying him with an expression that seemed almost puzzled, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with whatever he'd been told to expect. They reached a command post in a commandeered villa by nightfall, and Samuel was pushed into a cellar room that smelled of damp stone and old wine. There was a wooden chair in the center, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. All the theatrical touches of interrogation from a Hollywood movie, except this was real. His blood still fresh on his torn flight suit, his body aching from the crash and the long march. He sat in the chair because standing seemed like a waste of energy he might need later, and he waited in the dim light, listening to boots moving on the floor above, German voices discussing things he couldn't understand. When the door opened again, the man who entered wasn't wearing a Wehrmacht uniform, but the gray-blue of the Luftwaffe, German Air Force. He was tall and thin, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of posture that suggested aristocratic breeding or at least officer training that had beaten perfect bearing into his spine. He carried a folder under one arm and studied Samuel for a long moment before speaking in excellent English with only the slightest accent. "Lieutenant Cross, I am Hauptmann Richter. I understand you were piloting the B-24 that went down this morning." Samuel repeated his name, rank, and serial number. "Nothing more." Richter smiled slightly as if he'd expected this. "Yes, the Geneva Convention. You know your protocols, Lieutenant. That is good. That is ... professional." The word hung in the air between them. Professional, and Samuel heard the subtle emphasis, the quiet surprise embedded in the compliment. Richter pulled up another chair and sat, not across from Samuel in the aggressive interrogator's position, but slightly to the side, almost conversational. "You must understand, Lieutenant, that you present something of an interesting case. We do not see many Negro officers. In fact, ... single quotes," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Our intelligence briefings have told us that your country does not trust men of your race with such responsibilities, that you are employed primarily in service roles, labor battalions. Yet here you are, wearing the silver bars of a lieutenant, commanding a bomber crew. How do you explain this contradiction?" Samuel met his eyes and said nothing. "Let them wonder. Let them struggle with their own propaganda." Richter studied him for another moment, then opened his folder and began reading from what appeared to be Samuel's service record, how they'd obtained it so quickly. Samuel couldn't imagine, unless they'd been tracking the Tuskegee unit specifically. "Trained at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. Graduated third in your flight class. 17 combat missions over North Africa and Italy prior to your capture. Shot down 1 Messerschmitt Bf-109 confirmed, 1 probable." Richter looked up. "You are a very accomplished pilot, Lieutenant Cross. Your record suggests a level of skill and discipline that is ... Unexpected, the backhanded compliment stung worse than open hatred would have, but Samuel kept his face neutral, giving Richter nothing. The German officer seemed almost frustrated by this, by the calm dignity that Samuel wore like armor. "Do you know what I find most curious?" Richter continued, leaning forward slightly. "I was in America before the war. I visited your country in 1936, spent time in several of your southern states. I saw how your Negro population was treated, separated, relegated to inferior facilities, denied basic rights. I saw signs above water fountains designating which were for whites and which for Colorads. I saw restaurants that would not serve Negro patrons. And I thought to myself, how interesting that the Americans speak of freedom and democracy while practicing their own form of racial hierarchy." He paused, watching for a reaction. "Yet now your country sends men like you to fight against our racial policies. Do you not find that hypocritical, Lieutenant? Are you not fighting for a nation that considers you inferior?" It was a trap, Samuel knew, designed to shake his loyalty, to create doubt and division. It was also, he realized with bitter clarity, not entirely wrong. Every word Richter spoke was true: the segregation, the discrimination, the daily humiliations, large and small, that defined life for a Negro in America in the Army, even as a commissioned officer. He'd eaten in separate mess halls, used separate latrines, endured the casual contempt of white soldiers and officers who couldn't reconcile his rank with the color of his skin. He'd fought for the right to fight, spending months proving he was capable of flying the same aircraft, executing the same missions, bearing the same dangers as any white pilot. And even now, captured by the enemy, he was being asked to answer for his country's sins, to justify his loyalty to a nation that had never quite claimed him as its own. But Samuel had learned long ago that there were different kinds of battles, different forms of warfare. Name, rank, serial number, he said quietly, and the steadiness in his voice seemed to surprise Richter more than any passionate defense could have. Because what Samuel understood, what he'd always understood, was that his dignity was his weapon, his discipline, his declaration of humanity. He wouldn't argue or justify or explain. He would simply be what he was, a soldier, an officer, a man, and force them to reckon with that reality. Richter sighed and closed the folder. You will be transported to a POW camp for Allied air officers. Stahlecluft 3 in Germany. You will find it ... adequate if not comfortable. The Luftwaffe prides itself on treating captured airmen with respect in accordance with the Geneva Convention. He stood, then paused at the door. I must tell you, Lieutenant, you are not what we expected. Your bearing, your discipline ... It challenges certain assumptions. He seemed about to say more, then simply nodded and left, the door closing behind him with a hollow thud that echoed in the stone cellar. Samuel sat alone in the darkness, feeling the weight of that encounter settle over him. Challenges certain assumptions. It was the closest thing to respect he'd received from a white officer in months, and it had come from an enemy interrogator in an Italian cellar while American blood still stained his flight suit. The irony was so sharp it almost made him laugh. Except nothing about this was funny, nothing about any of it had ever been funny. The transport to Stahlecluft 3 took 3 days by rail. Samuel crammed into a boxcar with dozens of other captured Allied airmen, British, American, Canadian, even a few Australians. Most of them were white, and their reactions to Samuel's presence ranged from surprise to discomfort to outright hostility. A captain from Tennessee made a point of moving to the far side of the car when Samuel sat down, and a bombardier from Brooklyn kept staring at him like he was a puzzle that needed solving. But a few others, a British flight lieutenant who'd been shot down over Hamburg, a tall Canadian navigator with a broken arm and a makeshift sling nodded at him with the weary solidarity of men who'd all lost the same fight, who were all prisoners now regardless of what separated them in the free world. They traveled through Austria into Germany and through the gaps in the boxcar's walls. Samuel caught glimpses of a country at war-bombed cities, industrial centers churning smoke into gray skies, civilians going about their daily lives with the determined grimness of people trying to maintain normalcy in abnormal times. At night, the train stopped at various stations, and German guards would open the doors to pass in buckets of water and pieces of hard bread. During one of these stops, Samuel overheard 2 guards talking in German, and though he couldn't understand most of it, he caught one word repeated several times: Neger. They were talking about him. One guard kept glancing his way, and Samuel met his gaze steadily until the German looked away first, visibly unsettled. Stahlecluft 3 sat in the flat, forested country of Lower Silesia, a sprawling complex of wooden barracks surrounded by double wire fences, guard towers posted at regular intervals, searchlights that would sweep the grounds at night. When their boxcar finally arrived and the doors were pulled open, Samuel emerged into the winter cold of a German January, his breath misting in the air, his body stiff from 3 days of barely moving. The guards lined them up and rose, and a Luftwaffe officer, different from Richter but with the same crisp efficiency, began the processing, checking names against lists, assigning barracks numbers, delivering the speech that Samuel suspected every new prisoner heard. You are now guests of the German Luftwaffe. You will be treated in accordance with international law. Escape attempts will be punished. Cooperation will make your stay more comfortable. Resistance will not be tolerated, as they were marched toward their assigned compounds. Samuel became aware of the other prisoners watching from barracks windows, faces pressed to the glass, observing the new arrivals with the bored curiosity of men who had little else to occupy their attention. He saw their expressions shift when they noticed him, the double takes, the pointed stares, the whispered comments to fellow prisoners, a Negro officer, in their camp and their war, the impossibility of it written across their faces. They assigned him to the south compound, to a barracks that already housed 30 other captured airmen, and when Samuel stepped through the door with his meager bundle of belongings, a change of underwear, a thin blanket, the small Bible his mother had given him, the conversation in the room died instantly. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward him, and in that silence Samuel could feel the full weight of his difference, his otherness, the way his presence disrupted their comfortable categories and assumptions. A major from Ohio stood from his bunk, looked Samuel up and down, and said flatly, "They got you boys flying now." Jesus Christ, what's the army coming to? Samuel found an empty bunk in the corner, the worst position, furthest from the stove that provided the only heat, closest to the door where the cold draft came through, and set his things down without responding. He'd learned that sometimes silence was the strongest reply, that men like the major were less interested in answers than in asserting their own superiority, in maintaining the hierarchy they'd known their entire lives. But a younger lieutenant, a pilot from Illinois named Morrison, crossed the room and extended his hand. "Welcome to the war's worst hotel, Lieutenant. Name's Jim Morrison. That's my bunk there. You need anything, you let me know." The handshake was brief but genuine, and Samuel felt something in his chest unclench slightly. Not everyone would be hostile. Not everyone would make this harder than it already was. Over the next few days, he began to learn the rhythms of camp life, the morning roll call in the frozen yard, the thin soup and black bread that constituted meals, the endless hours of waiting and boredom punctuated by brief moments of terror when guards would storm through the barracks looking for contraband or conducting random searches. He learned which guards were merely doing their jobs and which took pleasure in small cruelties. He learned that the senior Allied officer in their compound was a British group captain named Henderson, who ran the camp with military precision, maintaining discipline and morale among the prisoners as if they were still an active unit rather than captured men waiting out the war. And he learned that his presence troubled people, both the German guards and his fellow prisoners, in ways that went deeper than simple prejudice. It was as if his very existence as a black officer challenged fundamental assumptions about order and hierarchy and who belonged where in the world structure. German guards who'd been trained to see Negroes as inferior by Nazi propaganda couldn't quite reconcile that ideology with the reality of Samuel's bearing, his calm professionalism, the way he followed protocols and conducted himself with the same military discipline as any white officer. And American prisoners who'd grown up in a segregated society, who'd never questioned the rightness of separation and racial hierarchy, found themselves sharing tight quarters with a Negro who wore the same uniform, held the same rank, and had fought the same enemy with the same courage. The moment that changed everything came 6 weeks into Samuel's captivity, during a particularly brutal February cold snap when the temperature dropped so low that the water in the wash basins froze overnight, and men woke with ice in their hair. The commandant, the German officer in charge of the entire camp, announced a surprise inspection, and every prisoner was ordered to stand outside in the yard while guards searched the barracks for escape materials, contraband, anything that violated camp regulations. They stood in formation for over an hour, the cold working its way through their inadequate clothing, through skin and muscle down to the bone, men beginning to sway on their feet, some collapsing into the snow. Samuel stood in his position in the formation, his body screaming for warmth, for movement, for anything but this enforced stillness in the killing cold. He could see other men around him beginning to break, shifting their weight, hugging themselves, a few sitting down in defiance of the order to remain standing. The guards circulated through the formation, shouting at those who moved, occasionally striking men with rifle butts to keep them in place. And Samuel realized that this was a test, a deliberate cruelty designed to break them, to assert power, to remind them of their powerlessness. But Samuel had been tested before. He'd endured. He'd survived worse than cold. He'd survived the daily erasure of his humanity, the constant message that he was less than, other than, never quite enough. So he stood. He kept his eyes forward, his shoulders back, his breathing steady and controlled. He didn't let the cold show on his face. He didn't give them the satisfaction. And slowly he became aware that others around him were watching, taking strength from his stillness, matching his discipline with their own. Morrison, standing 2 rows over, caught his eye and gave the slightest nod. A British officer named Blackwood stopped shivering and straightened his spine. It was Hauptmann Richter who finally ended it, the same officer who'd interrogated Samuel in Italy, and who now served as second-in-command at Stalag Luft III. He emerged from the barracks and walked through the formation, studying the prisoners with an expression that might have been satisfaction, or might have been something else entirely. When he reached Samuel, he stopped. Their eyes met. Richter studied him for a long moment, taking in Samuel's rigid posture, his controlled breathing, the absolute discipline written in every line of his body, despite the cold that had broken stronger men around him. "Lieutenant Cross," Richter said quietly, speaking English so only Samuel and a few nearby prisoners could hear, "you may tell your men to return to the barracks. The inspection is concluded." The phrasing struck Samuel immediately. Your men. As if he commanded this formation, as if his rank meant something here. It was a small thing, perhaps meaningless, perhaps just a turn of phrase. But in that frozen yard, with men collapsing from cold and guards still circulating with rifles and clubs, It felt like recognition, like Richter was acknowledging something he hadn't been able to acknowledge before. Samuel saluted, crisp and correct, despite his frozen limbs. Richter returned the salute with equal precision before striding away across the yard. Group Captain Henderson, who'd been standing at the front of the formation, turned and called out the order. "Dismissed. Everyone inside, quickly now." As the prisoners broke formation and stumbled toward the barracks, Henderson caught Samuel's arm. "That was well done, Lieutenant. You're bearing out there, ... It set an example. Thank you, the words were simple. But coming from Henderson, a career RAF officer who'd flown in World War I and commanded bomber squadrons over Germany, they carried weight. Recognition from a fellow officer, not despite Samuel's race, but simply because of his conduct. His discipline, his refusal to break. Inside the barracks, as men huddled around the stove, trying to regain feeling in their extremities, Morrison came over to Samuel's bunk. "I don't know how you did that," he said quietly, standing there like a damn statue while the rest of us were falling apart. "Where'd you learn that kind of control?" Samuel looked at him, considering how to answer. How much to explain about what it meant to be a Negro in America, how that daily requirement to prove yourself, to exceed expectations, to never give them an excuse to call you inferior had built in him a kind of strength that white men rarely needed to develop. But instead he just said flight training was harder, which was true, but not the whole truth, never the whole truth. The incident shifted something in the barracks, in the compound, perhaps even in the camp. Word spread about the Negro lieutenant who'd stood like stone in the killing cold, who'd earned a salute from Hauptmann Richter, who'd been singled out by the German officer in what felt like a gesture of respect. Some prisoners remained hostile. The major from Ohio still made a point of not speaking to Samuel directly, still referred to him as that boy when he thought Samuel couldn't hear, but others began to approach him differently. They asked his opinion during the evening discussions about news from the war, included him in the elaborate escape planning committees that every POW camp seemed to develop, even though escape from Stalag Luft III was nearly impossible, saved him portions of the Red Cross parcels that arrived sporadically and made the difference between slow starvation and mere hunger. And the German guards, particularly the Luftwaffe officers, began treating Samuel with a careful correctness that bordered on deference. It was as if his discipline had forced them to confront the gap between their propaganda and reality, between what they'd been told about Negro inferiority and what they observed in Samuel's daily conduct. Richter, in particular, seemed almost fascinated by Samuel, stopping to speak with him during yard time, asking questions about American aviation tactics that Samuel politely deflected with name, rank, and serial number, engaging in a careful dance of interrogation and resistance that became almost intellectual in its restraint. During one of these encounters, in the spring of 1944, when the snows had finally melted and the camp yard was a sea of mud, Richter approached Samuel while he was walking the perimeter, the endless circuit that prisoners made to stay fit and sane, circling the fence like caged animals wearing a path in the earth. "May I walk with you, Lieutenant Cross?" Richter asked, and Samuel nodded, understanding that refusal wasn't really an option. They walked in silence for a few moments, and then Richter said, "I've been thinking about our conversation in Italy, about the contradictions in your country's treatment of its Negro population." He glanced at Samuel. "I wonder if you think this war will change things. If your service, your sacrifice will earn you the equality you have been denied." It was a genuine question. Samuel realized, not a trap or an interrogation technique, but actual curiosity. "I don't know," Samuel said honestly, because he didn't. He'd thought about it during the long nights in his cold bunk, wondered if the blood he and other Negro soldiers were spilling in Europe and the Pacific would purchase something more than just military victories, if it would finally prove what should never have needed proving, that black Americans were full citizens, full humans, deserving of all rights and dignities. "But I know, we're owed it. We're owed everything any soldier who fights for his country is owed." Richter nodded slowly. "I imagine you will find, as we have found in Germany, that ideology is a powerful force. It shapes how people see the world, what they believe to be true and natural and right. Changing that... It is more difficult than winning battles." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I confess, Lieutenant, that you have changed certain things I believe to be true. About capacity, about potential. You have conducted yourself with honor and discipline that would be noteworthy in any officer of any nation. This has been educational." It was the closest thing to an apology Samuel was likely to receive from a German officer, and he recognized it as such. But he also recognized the profound sadness in it, that his humanity had to be proven, demonstrated, earned through exceptional conduct when white men were simply granted it by default. "Thank you, Hauptmann," he said, because what else could he say? They walked the rest of the circuit in silence, two officers on opposite sides of a war. briefly connected by a fragile thread of mutual respect built on the ruins of propaganda and prejudice. The war ground on. News filtered into the camp through secret radios that prisoners had built from smuggled components, the invasion of Normandy in June 1944, the slow Allied advance across France, the Russian armies pushing from the east. Samuel listened to these reports with the complicated emotions of a prisoner who wanted his side to win but knew that liberation might not mean freedom, not real freedom, not for him. He thought about his mother in Alabama, wondered if she'd received notification that he'd been shot down, if she knew he was alive and imprisoned rather than dead in some Italian field. He thought about the white officers he'd served with, some of whom had treated him with respect and others who'd never seen past his skin. He thought about the future, about what kind of America would exist when this war ended. In January 1945, with Russian artillery audible in the distance and the Germans growing increasingly anxious about Soviet advances, the commandant announced that Stalag Luft III was being evacuated. All prisoners would march west, away from the Russian front to other camps deeper in German-held territory. It was the middle of winter, the coldest January in memory, and the march, which would later be called the Long March or the Death March, depending on who told the story, would cover nearly 60 miles through snow and freezing temperatures with minimal food and inadequate clothing. They marched in columns, thousands of Allied prisoners under guard, and Samuel found himself walking beside Morrison and Blackwood and Henderson, all of them focused on the simple task of putting one foot in front of the other, of surviving one more hour, one more mile. Men collapsed in the snow and were left behind. Whether they died or were taken to hospitals, Samuel never learned. The cold was unlike anything he'd experienced, worse even than that formation in the frozen yard, because this cold went on, day after day, night after night, no warm barracks to retreat to, no hot soup waiting at the end. They slept in barns when they could find them, in the open snow when they couldn't, huddled together for warmth, regardless of rank or nationality or race, because survival was the only thing that mattered now. On the third night of the march, crammed into a barn with 100 other prisoners, Samuel felt his strength finally beginning to fail. His body was eating itself, burning through the last reserves of fat and muscle, and he could feel himself slipping toward that gray place where men simply stopped moving, sat down in the snow, and never got up. Morrison, who'd been watching him with concern, pressed something into Samuel's hand, a piece of chocolate from a hoarded Red Cross parcel, precious beyond measure. "Eat it," Morrison said. "That's an order, Lieutenant." Samuel wanted to refuse, wanted to tell Morrison to keep it for himself, but his body overruled his pride and he ate the chocolate in small bites, letting it melt on his tongue, feeling it anchor him back to life for one more day. They reached a temporary camp after a week of marching, then were loaded onto trains again, transported to another camp, then another. The order and structure of Stalag Luft III dissolved into chaos as the German military collapsed around them. As supplies disappeared, as guards became increasingly nervous and trigger-happy. And then one morning in April 1945, Samuel woke to silence. No guards patrolling, no morning roll call. Just silence, and then, gradually, the sound of engines approaching. American engines. American voices. American soldiers pouring into the camp wearing uniforms Samuel hadn't seen in over a year. Liberation felt like a dream, unreal and overwhelming. The American Gs who freed them stared at Samuel in his tattered uniform with the same surprise he'd grown accustomed to seeing, but this time it was mixed with something else, a kind of horrified pity at what the war had done to him, to all of them. A medic checked him over, said he'd lost 40 pounds, showed signs of frostbite and malnutrition, but would survive. Would survive. The words seemed almost absurd. He'd survived so much already. They flew him back to England, then eventually to the States, and Samuel stood on American soil for the first time in 18 months on a humid June morning that felt like drowning after so much cold. He thought they might send him home, discharge him with honors and gratitude. But instead they sent him to a segregated hospital in Virginia where Negro veterans recovered in separate wards from white soldiers, where nurses who were themselves officers had to use separate facilities based on race. He'd been a prisoner of the Germans for over a year, had survived interrogation and starvation and a death march through winter, had earned the respect of enemy officers through nothing but his discipline and bearing, and now he was back in an America that put him in a separate ward, a separate world. Reminded him at every turn that his service had changed nothing fundamental about his place in the nation's hierarchy. When they finally discharged him 6 weeks later, honorably, with a Purple Heart and a POW medal and the hollow words of a grateful nation, Samuel took the train south to Alabama, to the small town where his mother still lived in the same house he'd grown up in. He had to change trains in Birmingham, and during the layover he tried to buy a cup of coffee in the station cafe. The waitress looked at his uniform with its ribbons and decorations, looked at his face and said, "We don't serve Colorads." There's a place for you people around back. Samuel stood there for a moment, remembering Richter's careful respect, remembering the German officer's salute in that frozen yard, remembering how his discipline had forced even his enemies to see him as human, as worthy of consideration. And he understood with crushing clarity that he could command a bomber crew and survive captivity and earn medals for valor. But he couldn't buy a cup of coffee in his own country's train station, because the color of his skin mattered more than anything else he'd done or been or proven. He went around back to the colored waiting area with its cracked benches and dirty floor. And he sat with his mother's Bible in his lap, and he wept for the first time since his capture. Tears for everything he'd endured and everything that hadn't changed. For the bitter truth that he'd been treated with more dignity by the men who'd held him prisoner than by the country he'd fought to defend. An elderly Negro porter saw him crying and sat down beside him, said nothing for a long while, then quietly asked, "You just get back, son?" Samuel nodded. "From over there? The war?" Another nod. The porter sighed deeply. "It's going to take time. It's going to take more than this war. Maybe more than our lifetimes. But it's going to change. It has to change. Men like you, what you did, what you proved, it matters. Maybe not today. Maybe not for years. But it matters." Samuel wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that his service meant something beyond the temporary respect of German officers who'd been forced to reckon with their own propaganda. He wanted to believe that every Negro soldier who'd fought and died and suffered in this war had purchased something more valuable than military victory, that they'd bought a down payment on equality, on justice, on the full citizenship that should never have been conditional in the first place. But sitting in that segregated waiting room with his medals pinned to his chest and his tears still wet on his face, belief was harder than flying through flak, harder than standing in the frozen yard, harder than anything he'd done in the war. The train home arrived and Samuel boarded it, took his seat in the colored car at the back, and watched the Alabama countryside roll past the window. He thought about Lieutenant Morrison, who'd shared his chocolate on the death march and who would go home to Illinois and probably never think again about the barriers Samuel faced daily. He thought about Group Captain Henderson, who'd thanked him for his bearing and his example, but who'd returned to in England, where Samuel would still be considered inferior simply because of his skin. He thought about Hauptmann Richter, who'd been educated by Samuel's discipline, but who'd served in an army that built concentration camps and murdered millions in the name of racial purity. And he thought about himself, about Lieutenant Samuel Cross, who'd survived everything the war could throw at him, but might not survive the peace, might not survive the daily humiliations and erasures and denials of his humanity that waited for him in the country he'd bled for. When he finally reached his mother's house, she stood on the porch in her Sunday dress, even though it was a Tuesday, and she opened her arms and he walked into them. Let her hold him while he shook with sobs. Let her rock him like she had when he was a child. "I'm home, Mama," he whispered. "I made it home." She pulled back and looked at him with eyes that held all the sorrow and strength of generations. Eyes that had seen her own father lynched for the crime of looking a white man in the face. Eyes that had watched her son leave for a war everyone said he shouldn't fight in, shouldn't be trusted to fight in, and she said, "Yes, baby." "You home. But here's just one more battle. You hear me? Everything you did over there, everything you survived, that was preparing you for what comes next, for the fight that's coming here, and for the fight that's already started." Samuel didn't fully understand what she meant then, in the summer of 1945, with the war just ended and the world trying to rebuild itself. But over the years that followed, as he watched Negro veterans return home to lynchings and discrimination, as he saw the slow, painful, hard-fought battle for civil rights begin to take shape, as he marched and organized and testified about his experiences, about how he'd been treated with more respect by German officers than by American ones, about the bitter irony of fighting fascism abroad while living under Jim Crow at home, he began to understand. The war had been the easy part. The war had rules, protocols, clear enemies and allies. What came after was harder because it was messier, more complicated, more personal. He lived to see buses desegregated and lunch counters integrated and voting rights protected by federal law. He lived to see Negro astronauts and generals and senators and eventually a Negro president. He lived long enough to tell his story to historians who were finally, belatedly interested in the experiences of black posts in World War II, who wanted to understand how men like him had navigated the impossible position of being both American soldiers and second-class citizens, both prisoners of war and prisoners of their own country's racial hierarchy. And he always told them the same thing, always came back to that moment in the frozen yard at Stalag Luft 3 when Hauptmann Richter had saluted him, had called the prisoners his men, had recognized in Samuel's discipline something that ideology said shouldn't exist. "That German officer saw me," Samuel would say, his voice still strong even in his 80s. "He didn't want to, his whole worldview said he shouldn't, but my conduct forced him to see me as a soldier, as a man, as someone worthy of respect. And I've spent my whole life since then trying to make America do the same thing, trying to force this country to see it, to Negro citizens, the way that German officer finally saw me, not because we're exceptional, not because we have to prove ourselves beyond what's expected of anyone else, but simply because we're human beings deserving of dignity and rights and opportunity." He'd pause, remembering. It shouldn't have taken a war. It shouldn't have taken me being a prisoner. It shouldn't have required that kind of discipline and endurance, but that's what it took. And that's what it's still taking every day. Samuel Cross died in 2003, at the age of 84, in a country that had changed in profound ways from the one he'd left in 1943, but that, still, struggled with the legacy of its racial history. At his funeral, they folded the flag that had draped his coffin and presented it to his daughter, and a color guard from the Air Force, now integrated, now welcoming black pilots not as exceptions but as equals, fired a salute over his grave. Among the mourners was an elderly white man who'd flown with Samuel in those final months before the plane went down over Anzio, and he stood with tears streaming down his face and said to anyone who would listen, he was the finest officer I ever served with, the finest man I ever knew. And I'm ashamed it took me so long to realize that, to really see him in the end. Samuel's story was the story of countless black soldiers who'd fought in World War II, men who'd served with courage and distinction, who'd earned the respect even of their enemies, who'd proven themselves in every way possible, but who'd returned to an America that still denied them basic rights and dignity. His discipline, his bearing, his refusal to accept the inferiority that both Nazi propaganda and American segregation tried to impose on him, these became not just survival strategies, but weapons in a longer war. The war for full citizenship and equality that would stretch across decades and generations. The iron in his eyes, that quality that had impressed Hauptmann Richter and steadied his fellow prisoners in that frozen yard, was the same iron that had been forged in the fires of resistance and endurance that defined the black experience in America. He'd been a prisoner twice, once in the camps of Nazi Germany, once in the segregated society of Jim Crow America. He'd escaped the first when Allied armies liberated him. The second took the rest of his life to break free from, and even then the work remained unfinished. Passed on to children and grandchildren who carried forward the fight he'd begun by simply standing, straight in the cold and refusing to let anyone, enemy or countryman, reduce him to anything less than what he was, a man, a soldier, an American who deserved better than what America had given him, but who'd given America everything nonetheless.